everybody. Welcome to the 706 podcast, where we collectively decide which 706 movies are the greatest films ever created. Hello, I'm Kirk. I'm your host this week. I'm joined by my three prolific and astute and handsome co-hosts, Tony, Connor, and Anthony. Why don't you say hello in that order?
Hi, guys. Only two of those qualities apply to me. I'll let you decide which those are.
Hi. Oh, wait. What was the order again? I already forgot.
My goodness. Oh, my gosh.
I'm
Is
the
this what a
prolific
Zoom
one.
class feels
I'm
like for
Connor.
elementary school kids? Go ahead. Anthony, say hi.
I drew a kitten.
Anthony.
I suddenly have a newfound respect for teachers in the age of COVID. Folks, we're going to be discussing a movie today. It's a classic movie. It's a movie from 1951. I will place a bet that most of you were not alive when this movie was created, who are listening right now. Except for you, Graham. Just kidding, you're dead. So we're going to talk about a movie called A Place in the Sun. It stars Elizabeth Taylor, Montgomery Clift. It's actually a movie based on a novel. Well, based on a play that was based on a novel. So it's survived a lot of mediums. And the novel's written by Theodore Dreiser. The movie itself is directed by George Stevens. Like I said, 1951, black and white. It's a love story, kind of mixed with some tragic elements. I will rely on my co-host to frame it and contextualize it better than I can, as I am quite a layman when it comes to classic films. But this one stood out to me. Let me just give a brief synopsis. Basically, the movie follows one George Eastman, played by Montgomery Clift. He's a man of humble beginnings who has a very wealthy uncle, and he goes to work for his uncle's company. And he meets a woman there, and they start up a romance, and she becomes pregnant. Meanwhile, he starts a subsequent parallel relationship with Angela Vickers, who's played by Elizabeth Taylor. She is a debutante in high society, and you can tell his true feelings are with her. But he starts to lead this double life where he has to find a way to extricate himself from the relationship with Alice, who's played by Shelley Winters, the poor assemblywoman who he first was keen on, but now he wants more, right? He wants to ascend. So he ends up, she dies in a tragic accident. We'll talk more about that, but he is tried and convicted for her murder, actually, and sentenced to death, and that's where the movie ends. So it's kind of a tragic film, but there are a lot of elements at play. So I'm going to go with the person who actually bequeathed this honor to me to be here today, and that is Mr. Connor. I would love to hear your thoughts. I know you haven't seen this film. Let's hear it.
No, I have not, Kirk, and I'm surprised I hadn't heard of it before. Obviously, it really strikes me by just how unremittingly tragic it is and how that doesn't seem to gel somehow with the love story aspect of it. I mean, obviously, there are other stories like this, but yeah, I wasn't expecting quite that conclusion, right, of ultimately him being executed or about to be executed. And I found it compelling, certainly in the second half, right, as we get past this accident, right, and seeing the psychological struggle of Montgomery Clift's character. And Montgomery Clift, plays this in a really amazing way. And I think throughout, also it's doing a lot of work. It's not just the acting is good, but the kind of the direction and certainly the photography in this movie is really great. I think for 1951, there's a lot of kind of showy, maybe not showy, but just effective and cool shots and creative ways of doing this, which you didn't have to. I mean, this was an adaptation of a play, right? I think they went out of their way to use the medium of film to sell this story and to build this kind of this involvement with this character. However, I would say kind of the fundamental problem of the movie, I think, is kind of the first half. And it's just because it's just how am I supposed to feel about Montgomery Clift? Obviously, we're like, well, of course this was going to happen. And there's just a weird place of being connected to that character, who we're asked to sympathize with. Obviously, he does something very wrong. I mean, I never for instance, I never really buy his relationship with Shelley Winters. There's something kind of sad about it from the very beginning. So once the Liz Taylor thing comes around, there's no hope. It was just very bleak, from the very beginning. And, you sort of see where it's going. Like I said, it becomes interesting right after the accident, after basically he attempts to murder her or plans to kill Shelley Winters off to be able to be with Liz Taylor. But yeah, that to me felt a little weaker. I felt like there could have been more wrinkles in that plot. There could have been more to engage. But I don't know how you guys felt. I mean, like I said, but I think my overall take is that, obviously it's a great, interesting story, and that just like the execution was really on point, and kind of above and beyond in terms of the kinds of images we see in this movie, like the great shot of the when they go on the speedboat and we see a radio in the foreground that tells us about the discovery of the dead body, right? Anyway, so that's my general take.
Another great touch on that shot, just because you brought it up, is the way we only hear snatches of the radio news report. Passing speedboats drown out portions of it, so we're just getting these little fragments. I thought that was a very inspired and interesting touch.
Yeah,
definitely. Thank you, Connor. So it seems like the mechanical aspects of the film gelled a little bit more with you, and maybe you liked the pieces that made up the film as opposed to maybe the grand arc of the film a little more, perhaps. So let's go to Tony. I don't want to give Anthony short shrift here, but Anthony has seen this movie, so I kind of want an unfiltered view as much as possible from Tony, and then we'll go to Anthony, who is really the bedrock of our podcast, as we all know anyway. So let's go to Tony. What do you have to say for yourself?
Well, what do you have to say for yourself? You sick bastard. You picked this movie. No.
How do you sleep at night?
Yeah. No, so the first thing I was surprised by was how much of a Tony movie this was. This felt very much in my wheelhouse thematically, kind of the idea of like that oppressive kind of guilt, and of course the chickens coming home to roost, as we've discussed before, which of course they do by the end. Although that aspect of it was almost my least favorite. What I thought was cool about this movie was there is a very kind of dreamlike feel to it, an almost nightmarish feel. There's times where the score almost feels like something out of a horror movie or out of a thriller in terms of like the piercing strings. There's moments. I wish I could remember what scene in particular I'm thinking of, but there's one scene where you're just hearing like, it's like a horror score. And my girlfriend, when I was watching with my girlfriend, she was like, "Oh my God, like it's like a horror movie right now." And that's how it feels. It's like, Jesus, like this, we're in a bad, we're going into a dark place. This isn't good. And of course, the heavy use of shadow, the heavy use of shadow. There's scenes where two characters are talking and we can't even really see them, which is a very unconventional, even in like a noir film, you would rarely have it so dark that you literally can't see the faces of like one of your main characters in the scene. There was a very strong choice. Of course, the scene I mentioned, or Connor mentioned, with the radio on the beach, there's a lot of these little details of kind of nightmarish touches where it accentuates like the horrible nature of this situation, really from the perspective of our Cliff Montgomery's character, George Eastman. How could I forget George Eastman? Great name. From his perspective as he goes through this situation, which is very interesting that they make it kind of from his perspective, because of course in the first half it establishes that he's like kind of a scumbag. Like he's really not a good guy. He's really just kind of lying to these two women and just like kind of very, very slimy, very irresponsible, really just out for himself, trying to kind of, his goal throughout the movie seems to be to get himself into a better financial or social position, right? I mean, that is at least part of course, Elizabeth Taylor is very beautiful and she's meant to be beautiful. And I think she's presented as being more beautiful than Shelley Winters, which is never stated, but I think the way she's like made up and the way she's dressed or whatever, it's supposed to be like, oh, this is like the hotter woman and this is what he's kind of gravitating to, right? But I think a big part of it too is the fact that she comes from this wealthy family and he would be furthering his career and his long-term financial process by marrying into this family. It's established that he grew up kind of poor and he's probably trying to kind of make his way in the world. At the start of the movie, he's hitchhiking, right? Which is very interesting. It starts out with him hitchhiking, kind of coming from nowhere and coming into this mansion, this opulence, this, grandness. And that's the world he can have. That's the world that's tempting him throughout the movie. And of course, there's the nightmarish tenor throughout of guilt and shame and related to sex. You know, him having sex with Shelley Winters is really the kind of the original sin. That's the biting the apple moment in the movie. It's not the, you know, murder, which isn't even really a murder. It's kind of left ambiguous, which is interesting in itself. It's almost felt like a criminal law exam question, you know, when you have the mens rea, but not the actus reus, or maybe the actus reus, but not the mens rea, you know, which is got one, but not the other. It's like it's not quite a murder. It's like almost a murder. Those themes resonate with me. I always liked them. I thought it was compellingly acted. I thought that Montgomery Clift's performance was fantastic. I loved all the close-up shots of him just sweatily dealing with what he's dealing with. There's so many just moments of he's just like going through it. And it's like, and I think what the movie does well is it, despite establishing so well that this guy is a scumbag, we feel for him. I mean, I feel for him. I'm sweating with him. I'm getting nervous. I'm rooting for him to get off or him to get out or whatever. And lastly, I will agree with Connor about the ending note feeling a little bit strange, to put it charitably, although I'd probably say a little off. It seems weird that it ends on the note of like, well, at least at the end of the day, his love with Elizabeth Taylor was true and it was good. And it's like, it really doesn't resonate with me. It really doesn't. I think it's meant to be like kind of this, almost like a payoff or like a twist or something. Well, actually, no, there was a real love there. There is something there. There is something we can get out of this situation. There is like a note of hope. There is something to this, which could be, I think if handled differently, maybe very cathartic or very beautiful. But I feel like the movie doesn't really set it up very well, to the sense that it feels more like out of nowhere than it feels like some kind of payoff of something that's been in the background the whole time. So anyway, I enjoyed this movie because it's up my particular alley, and I'll agree with a lot of what Connor said about the visuals, certainly, but I have my reservations as well.
All right. So fair enough, Tony. I think the ending is something to be discussed for sure, but all points well taken. Let's go to Anthony. You've seen the movie. Have you read the book?
No.
Okay. All right. Fair. So what do you have to say? Is this your second viewing or is this...
Yeah, it's my second viewing, and it's been, I think probably like over 5 or 6 years since I've last seen it. So, I've had some distance. I think there are two things to start on is one, Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift, as we've kind of alluded to, oh my God, they are definitely all of our grandparents' crushes at that time. My God, like they are two of some of the most attractive looking people for that period on the screen. They're just so magnetic and energetic every time you see them. But that's one thing. I think the second thing to point out is, if you're a faithful listener, this definitely fits in with our sort of death in the lake, category of films we've all grown and love. But, this sort of brings me, I think, to the kind of Leave Her to Heaven was kind of in the back of my mind in this kind of watch, especially maybe because that was more recent, with sort of like themes, parallels, and ideas. And similarly, the way Connor felt about that movie and the way he kind of liked the courtroom scene is once again the opposite of how I kind of feel about this one. Because for me, the energy and my favorite part of A Place in the Sun is up until the actual investigation. I think it loses something after the accidental murder, the manslaughter on the boat. I'm not fully invested in those moments, although I do find Montgomery Clift's performance kind of interesting. And I think part of the reason I'm lost there is because on the second rewatch, I know that, to me at least, the movie loses something on that ending note too, which is when, not necessarily about the love being true, but the part where the priest tells him that in his heart he probably did commit the murder. I think that if that was not there, this is otherwise the perfect Gatsby-esque narrative. And one thing I really love about this movie, though, as opposed to something like Gatsby even, is the way the rich are kind of portrayed. They're not extravagantly demonstrative at all times, except maybe in the boat and stuff like that, or the carefree nature of it. But I think that's really what Montgomery Clift overall desires. He grew up not just in a poor family, so there's always this sort of guilt of not wanting to be trapped in poverty. And I think what kind of, ultimately pushes him to even think about the murder too, is when she tells him, Shelley Winters' character, when she tells him, we may have to scrimp and save. I think that's one note. But I think the other idea underneath all this is the kind of life that his parents lived, which seemed to be sort of mission style, charity work. And it's the idea that you're always worried about something and that you're always worried about having to care for something else that also kind of, haunts him. Because to me, he's always someone who wants something carefree. He wants to escape the idea of always being burdened there. which is why I think we kind of lose track of the work itself as the movie goes on, because the rich don't really seem to work in the same way that people on the assembly line do, and the way he does in the kind of beginning. But anyway, I won't go on too long. I'll just say my final point is, from memory, I've loved Montgomery Clift's performance, and I think it's fantastic. But on this rewatch, Elizabeth Taylor's performance, I think, is like amazing. I think it's so good, and I think the way she sells that role, which is not quite like a femme fatale, but something kind of innocent, something just attractive, and kind of brilliantly always knowing something underneath, I think, the way he's portraying, himself to be. I think she kind of gets something there. And each time I watch those scenes with them together, just, that like becomes the movie for me. So I really liked it.
Okay. She's kind of like the chickadee or the cockatiel in the jailhouse, right? She's overtly naive, yet so endearing and ruthlessly compassionate, right? But Anthony, I wanted to clarify what you said. Why did that not work? The moral exoneration or the moral indictment at the end from the priest, what would you have preferred? Why did that not gel with you? Yeah, I just want to hear what you have to say on that.
Sure. I think one thing, and I mean, I may be leaning too heavily on this sort of Gatsby-esque, but I think it's so rooted in our American culture, even though the play and the book are from, a similar time as when Gatsby's released. I think there's a real sense of tragedy, which is if you're not born rich, you're always susceptible to these sort of outcomes of tragedy, of, downfall, of ruin, on and on. And I think for the movie to be sort of true to that kind of spirit or that type of rags to riches story that goes wrong, he has to kind of think about it as still tragically happening to him. I think the sense that like he did it and knows he did it puts a sort of a blame on his type of character that doesn't kind of fit that overall American society, American attitude that's underlying the surface.
I see. So more structural, you would have preferred kind of tone at the end or an insinuation about kind of the fraught nature of this ascent into high society.
I really don't think that part's necessary. I think the priest could have just been there and maybe his mom.
I also think that on that note, I think it kind of undermines the kind of interesting ambiguity on that boat. I love that scene and the way she eventually does die. And I think it's so perfectly handled with, is he to blame? Because on one level, of course he is. On the other hand, it's like, well, am I a murderer, right? And that's kind of to me, a very tasty kind of moral ambiguity because it ties into his deeper shames and all this context, right? But I think when at the trial, they make all that explicit and they go relitigate it over and over and over. Well, did you want to kill her? Did you want? Well, I didn't want it. And it kind of kills it for me. It's almost like, like it was so interesting. It was so tasty. And then by like talking about it for like 20 minutes and then that final note of like the priest saying, actually, yeah, he's just a murderer. Like it kind of takes the wind. It undermines it a little bit. It undermines that interesting, dramatic idea, I think.
Okay. Something's better left in the shadows. I see.
Yeah.
So we'll revisit that a little bit later, but I just wanted to kind of share why this movie struck me. To reiterate, I think you've all made valid points. It's one of the movies where for me, it's more than the sum of its parts. I really enjoy just the feeling, the energy throughout the movie. I feel this kind of wistfulness of the character as he's like, George, he has this taste of his life that seems so forbidden, right? And it's now suddenly within reach, yet there's someone pulling him down. And that's obviously from his perspective. From her perspective, he's a narcissistic asshole, right? But the movie does enough for me to allow me to empathize significantly with George. And I can respect movies that do that. I don't like movies that kind of put you out there on a ledge and say, you better, or, this movie, kind of gives you some suggestions that can happen, whether they're subtle or not. Like, for instance, can you imagine if Shelley Winter's character had the same timbre, the same cadence as Elizabeth Taylor's character and vice versa? In the boat, she's really laying it on thick. Oh, poor George. We're going to be poor. We're going to scrap together. Like, she sounds like this whiny, snivelly, like old maid, and it really kind of feeds into that, where it's almost impressionistic in a sense. And likewise, Angela Vickers is she's got this breathy tone, and it's almost angelic, right, as her name implies. But there's just, this movie's entertaining to me. I think it has the whole package. I think the pacing is really what does it for me. The pacing as well as the acting. You can tell it has source material, because it really does feel like it's fully fleshed out to me, whether or not it's accurately or to the better or worse detriment, but it's a complete package, right? And there's some funny shots. Like, I think the jailhouse being stormed by some old villagers is one of the funniest 10 seconds of any movie I've ever seen. Like, it's just this, ironically speaking, like it's absolutely absurd that they would break the glass on the jailhouse like that with brooms and stuff. And then he hits a trick shot at the pool table that I don't know how many takes that took. That was amazing. Mm-hmm. And then just on second watch, you see little things like when he's hitchhiking, Angela's car drives right past him. She actually does drive past him in the beginning, the opening credits. So it's these little things, little touches, but ultimately, yeah, like I said, it's the ability to get into his skin, and you see him writhing, right, in these situations. He has such internal anguish. And to me, the more interesting moral question is, does he love Angela, or does he love the idea of Angela and everything that attends her lifestyle, right? And what that would mean to him. And so that's where I kind of try to figure out who he is. And the murder, yeah, it's a great kind of juridical question. Like, what are we dealing with here? Is this murder? If I hand someone a shotgun and it's loaded and then they trip and shoot themselves, am I implicated, right? Like, I've set the pieces in motion. But I want to just hear what you guys thought about George Eastman as far as what his motives were throughout. And I know, Tony, you've touched a little bit on this, but if you maybe want to expound upon it, but what his motives were, or if that rang true, or what helped you to either empathize, or what caused a disconnect or a discord in your viewing experience. And Connor, you touched on this too, but if anyone has any kind of supplemental, hearing everybody else speak, anyone has anything they want to kind of flesh out, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I mean, I think I almost wish that was more clear. I mean, I think obviously, it's fair enough the movie expects us to make that leap, that she represents all of these things. She is the better life, right? And there's plenty of, sort of clues laid down as to his background, right? And, obviously but I think, again, when we talk about the final image of the movie being her, right, it tries to anchor it so much in that, well, he was in love with her, and that kind of like, sort of absolves him of being, again, that kind of absolves him of making that choice, right, a little bit, because it's kind of like, well, he of course he was in love with her. He just happened to have this relationship with this woman, and then, right, he fell in love with Liz Taylor, although technically he says that he fell in love with her the first time he saw her, which was before he even was involved with Shelley Winters. So that makes it complicated, and obviously it's so like, especially if like you're watching again, if you know that relationship's coming up, and if you watch it retroactively knowing that he loves Liz Taylor, right, which I guess we kind of do, right, when we see her, we know, right, obviously it makes an impression on him, right, like how you're supposed to get behind him in any way, right, by pursuing this relationship with Shelley Winters. It's kind of like, not that it's abnormal, but in the context of everything else, it just seems so strange, yeah. And so it feels so brutal on that level for that beginning portion. So I think it's become so hard to kind of to relate to him. And at that point, it's like, I don't even care if he doesn't want to kill her or not. He's basically already killed her. He's basically already done this to her. It's like he's already so guilty. And almost, I don't find much interest in whether he killed her or not. It's more, how he struggles or how he's going to try to wriggle out of the situation.
Me too. Yeah. But I would plead some innocence, and this is for the comment Tony made. Perhaps we have to think about this through the lens of 69 years ago, where, you hear stories, oh, I met my wife and 10 days later we were married. You know what I mean? Like that kind of anachronistic notion of not truly understanding a person before we fall in love with them. Like we almost fall in love with who they are artificially, right? And these
Yeah.
are two very attractive people. And so there's some symbiosis there naturally. Like it's all, it makes sense. It's like, oh yeah, your babies would be extremely beautiful. You guys should procreate. Like, but that's where I would say, like, maybe we hopefully we can have some leniency for the film might be a little dated in that
Wait, what did I say that you were answering right now? I don't.
Oh, you said it. You don't know if it made sense that their love was really genuine to begin with. Like, there wasn't enough groundwork laid. Because it's true. Like, he says, like, I love you the second time they're with each other. And so that's a little strange to our modern ears.
But did you find that final scene, like, really cathartic and really, like, oh my God, like, they did love each other, and, like, you really respond to that? Like, are you emotionally invested in that relationship?
So here's the thing. I'm a sentimentalist at heart, and for better or worse. And when that music, those strings are, so delicately playing, and you hear Elizabeth Taylor say that line that I think is a classic line. We spend the better part of our time saying goodbye. And I'm drawn to it. It's endearing to me. And I don't know if it works necessarily. Like, I think the illogical, I think what they're trying to convey is that love is irrational at times, and love can be ruthless and dangerous. And whether or not they succeed in that is up for grabs, but ultimately there's kind of a vibe that I really gravitate towards in this movie. And, it feels like there's some passionate moments exchanged between them, and it's obviously potentiated by the music, but by the score, which is excellent. But yeah, it probably for 90% of people, they're like, oh, this is trash, like at the end. Like,
I'm not saying trash. It's interesting. No, I think your reaction is valid. I'm curious how many people feel that way. Because for me, at no part of that, I think the problem for me is at no point am I really earnestly rooting for this couple. Am I like, oh my God, I just want them to work it out. I want them to be happy together. I'm so in his head, and I'm so in the head of like that guilt and that like darkness, and like thinking about Shelley Winters and like her horrible fate. You know what I mean? That's where I am. I don't feel the push and pull of the like I want them to be together. You know what I mean? So I guess that part of the movie falls flat for me because of that.
I think I'm so enamored by the bourgeois lifestyle at the end, like the luau party and everything.
Aren't we all the luau? Yeah.
Yeah, it's just kind of like, as a viewer, not as a rational human who wouldn't make these choices, but as a viewer, I see there's an allure there. And like, part of me is like, yeah, wow, my heart is with Angela. My heart isn't with Alice. And that's sad. And maybe it's an indictment of me, but perhaps that's just me living in a different part of my brain during the movie. I really think that's what it boils down to. Like, this part that is about love and about lust and aspiration, right? Whether, consequences be damned. And, but Anthony, how do you view George Eastman throughout this film? You think he's kind of a result or a consequence of this whole story is a consequence of societal, immobility, crystallization? Is that what you see, a la other kind of pieces of this era?
Yeah, I think that's one part of it. I think the other side too, though, and I think, to answer, maybe to kind of, put my own spin on some of those criticisms Tony and Connor have, is to think those, like, how much of the movie even wants us to root based on the movie's own logic for them. It's like, of course it does on one hand, because it's Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift. Even at that time, Elizabeth Taylor was already a big name and things like that. But in the movie's own, like, kind of sphere is, George Eastman is a character who just never fits and never belongs. He's always in the wrong place. He's not this sort of old money type person when he arrives. He's not the Eastman. He has to work for his name a bit differently. He also shows up. He's always dressed incorrectly. He was wearing a tweed suit in this kind of assembly line when all he needed to do was basically show up in his undershirt. He wears a suit with a tie to a classic evening cocktail when everyone's in bow tie and tails. And, it's all these kind of things that, show him that he never really belongs in either place. He feels too good for someone like, Shelley Winters' character. But at the same time, he feels like maybe that is where he belongs, I think. And that's kind of why he pursues that. But once I think we have to remember is Angela is the one who kind of approaches him. He never makes an effort to really mingle at that party, to kind of build himself as like this guy who's going to, strike it rich with all of them and, become part of them. He goes off into that room alone, and Angela has to go in there and basically make the move. And she does make the move. And I think when that relationship kind of happens, their relationship is always kind of funny too, because it always seems predicated on some impending tragedy. Kirk brought up the line about the goodbye at the end, and that's such a great line. But throughout the movie, she's telling him, like, I always feel like you're leaving. I always feel like, we're never really together. I always feel like you're about to, go off and disappear, or I feel like you're not here. So there's also the tragedy that he's never going to have a sense of communication with that relationship, because he has his own doubts about who he is. And that's kind of how I see that like relationship and why it kind of sputters on one hand. But I think there's something deeper there.
Yeah, well put, Anthony. I would say that's actually really cool the way you express that. And I would just say, to add one thing, I mean, I think for the very ending, I would say it's not fair to say that, well, we're supposed to feel, they did love each other after all, because that's obvious. Of course they did. But more just, that final image, the significance of that final image is, right, everything that he lost. It's that kind of that final taunting, vision, before he dies, right, of what could have been, right? And just to undersell retroactively, right, how much this mattered to him, right? How much that life that he could have had with her, right, would have mattered to him.
I just want to add one quick thing, and I'm going to go to Tony. One thing I noticed is, like, perhaps, or am positing, is perhaps she was drawn to him because from the moment she saw him, he was imbued with this tension that he was holding back. So it's almost like she was attracted to what he was displaying, like this transgression, right? Like he was kind of highlighting it or announcing it through his mannerisms, right? Like he said, I can't tell you, I better not, like, and maybe that was a draw for her, the mystery, right? And which is ultimately like the tragedy of it, because had she not, maybe if he were just, playing it a little more simple, he wouldn't seem so complex, and she would think he's kind of, not interesting really. And he isn't that interesting of a character. He's kind of awkward. He doesn't really talk much. But yeah, Tony, what did you think about, like, none of us mentioned the abortions, like, doctor scene. I thought that was great. Like, did you find that this movie had some kind of tinges of modern themes?
Oh no, of course
Yeah.
it did. I was impressed by how kind of real it got and how intense it got. And of course that scene, they can't say, no one says abortion or whatever, but it's made very, very clear that she's like trying, and it fits in the narrative too, because in that situation you can imagine they wouldn't want to say it either. She'd just be like, I heard you were a guy who could help me. And he's like, well, I don't know where you heard that, but go home, like tell your parents, and also just the darkness of its scenario. I mean, I think this movie does have some, real balls to kind of go to some of the places it does. I do think that was a fantastic scene. And I appreciated the amount of kind of respect this movie has for Shelley Winter's character, right? I mean, you can imagine a version of this movie where she's just kind of this cruel, almost punchline. And there are moments where it almost feels like it could go in that direction. But I think the movie gives her kind of an interiority and a sense of how precarious her situation is and how bad a position she is in. And she says, well, then I'll just kill myself. And she means it. But I mean, I get why. Like, I understand why being in that situation you would want to, right? And I think that also shows that they share, the bond they almost share is that terror, right? The idea like, well, I could always kill myself, right? And the idea like, if the secret comes out, that's your one option. And like, and you feel like Clift almost has that himself. George, I keep mixing names. Eastman himself might have that same mentality. The idea of the secret coming out is like too horrible to fathom. But one thing I appreciated, and I think that makes their relationship have a note of tragedy, and that they do share this experience. They do share this terror. The problem is the terror is related to each other. So there's no way they can really bond with that and grow together with it. The tragedy with Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift's relationship is that the thing that would make it possible for them to be together, which is basically Shelley Winters disappearing, going away, in this case dying, right, is the thing that means they can never be together, because that guilt is so overwhelming. Which is why when the wheels of justice finally start grinding and we see him go to his trial and stuff, it almost feels like an anticlimax, because to me, there's something so beautifully horrible about the tragedy of like him getting what he wants, but it being forever tainted because of what he did to get it. And that was the only way he could get it. But like that guilt has just completely poisoned it. And like in that like stretch, maybe 3/4 of the way from the movie, I was loving that feeling. I was loving that. And I was loving too that scene of him in the car with her, which is so painful and it feels so real. Or he's just like wanting to confess, but he can't. He's like, you're going to hear things about me and you'll still love me, right? And she's like, of course I would. But he's like, but she doesn't know. She doesn't know that I killed this girl, which whether or not he did, he thinks he did, right? On some level. So I thought that was very real and very like painful. And I think there's a lot of like glimpses we get into like really like horrifying psychic landscapes in this movie. Some really dark. I mean, this movie is dark. It's really
the car chase.
What?
There's a police chase. I mean, some of the stuff is
that was an ad. That's just an ad for being white. It's like, well, you keep doing this. She like tries to dive off the road. You're like, it's your 3rd time this summer. Next time I'll have to give you a ticket, young lady. Say hi to your dad.
That was so good. I love that. It's so perfectly dated. You know, it's carbon dating. Awesome. So let's we're winding down. Connor, what maybe would have worked better for you? Was it just from in the inception, you just couldn't really see how it made sense for a viewer to approach the situation? You know, like there's no winners, almost like the situation's so fraught that we can't really reconcile with it? Or how might it have been more affecting for you?
Yeah, it's so subjective, Kirk. You know, I think Anthony makes a good point that almost that whatever deficiency is there is kind of made up for in the kind of star factor. I think that is something part of the design of the movie almost, you know. And of course, like how much do we really have to sympathize with these characters? I don't know. I think maybe this is just me being a bad viewer, I guess, but I feel like you could have spelled out more, right, what the stakes of getting with Liz Taylor really are. I mean, of course we get that. Of course that's in the text of the film, right? You don't have to go too far for that, but I guess that's what I would say, right? If I had to improve that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's a tough question. I think there might be a way of kind of rewriting it in a certain way. I think Shelley Winters, although she definitely has some humanity, I think, you know, they go to, I think, extreme lengths a little bit to make herself kind of a bleak prospect, you know, and kind of an unappealing, you know, which Shelley Winters unfortunately always plays, these unappealing, you know, other love interests.
She does.
You know, which is unfair. You know, I think she's a great actress and whatever. So, but yeah, I don't know. Like, I think that character could have been a bit extended a little bit in some ways. But I don't know. It's a tough question, Kirk.
All right. Fair.
And I think as we've talked about it, I think I've realized it's not necessarily a problem with just that part. You know, maybe the ending I don't like quite as much. You know, as we've talked about it, I'm not as confident in my read, I think.
Okay. And then Anthony, any kind of, before we vote, I mean, is there any context to be had here? Is this movie in its place in 1951? And Connor or Tony, if you want to add anything, like, unfortunately, I'm a bad host. I didn't really do adequate research. I guess I could have. I know it was, it was well received generally, but I'm sure it was just a studio film, and yeah, I just wonder.
It won 6 Oscars, apparently. This is my very rudimentary IMDb. So yes, looks like it was very well received.
Yeah. But like in terms of tonally, like, doesn't this feel like it's a little more advanced, or perhaps it feels right at home?
I think yes and no. I think, for certain reasons, maybe even Connor's criticisms kind of point to some of or even your own, Kirk, the time factor of it, the kind of, you could watch it, without much knowledge of film history and almost point to the kind of decade or the time period it came out of. But I think at the same time, like many of the other like really good melodramas or even film noir dramas, of Douglas Sirk or on and on, there's something to be said for this particular style that was able to say a lot while at the same time never mentioning its true subjects, sex, abortion, the great taboos in 1951. It just seems so advanced at the same time, and in ways that even like Hitchcock movies don't fully, get to, I think.
Yeah, well said. And I'll just say in closing, I just think the melted ice cream, like there's just so many little pieces in this movie that just draw me in. I don't know what it is, but I'm so glued to this film and I just want to see what happens. And I guess it's maybe novel in the sense that I'm not really taking a strong moral position as I usually do. And for that, I would think the film deserves some credit. But let's go to voting. This is a tough one. I'm just going to go left to right on my screen. So Tony, take it away.
Okay. This is tough because there were things about this movie that I absolutely loved. And then there were things that there were just parts I just wish, like the third act to me just kind of loses me. Everything from the trial on, I'm just kind of like, I almost wish it had cut straight from, him seeing that guy in the woods, that mysterious man who turns out to be a cop, to him in his cell. I almost think that would have, for me, worked better rather than having us go through all that again. Two quick notes, though, two things that I neglected to mention earlier that I appreciated a lot, where I like the blankness of Eastman as a protagonist, how he's just kind of empty, because it makes him almost the dreamer, right? If this movie, I think, is, as I said, is very dreamlike, and I think it reinforced the idea that we are this guy. We are going through what he's going through in a subjective way, and we are experiencing these horrors as they come around the corner in the Haunted Mansion at Disney World. And also, I thought the frequent use of superimposing images on other ones created some kind of eerie effects. In particular, there's a shot of, this is very Freudian, very psychological. His mother is just overlaid over one of the party scenes, and she's just like shaking her head, and it goes for like 5 or 10 seconds. It's a very strange effect. So I don't know. So I'm gonna go soft yes, because I think there's a lot of cool stuff in this movie. I definitely see what you responded to. There are things in it I responded to, and I think the fact that it did come out in 1951 and deals with some of these very dark themes in a relatively frank way, I think is commendable. And so I would give it a yes.
All right. Anthony?
Yeah, it's an obvious yes for me. I'll also just do 2 quick points. But one of them, which is when he first calls his mom, to go with Tony's sort of dreamlike feeling. When he first calls his mom, in the background, you see the words that his uncle told him just a moment before, but it's, have you called your mother lately? Which is such a great detail. But also the second point, one thing I don't think we brought up, is when he finally gets the first promotion that ultimately kind of eventually leads him to the tragic route he comes in, it's totally by mistake. Is like he's worked months and months in that job. So also months in this place, you feel forgotten even if he doesn't admit it. I feel like, there's a sense of that, of also why he's drawn to Alice, because, and we find out in a very quick scene with the uncle that they did forget him. His uncle has to be reminded who this guy is. And I think that's a great little moment too. But anyway, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Another great point. Or the vicar's neon sign flashing outside his apartment window, little on the nose, but still effective. And Connor, what do you have to say?
Well, one thing that was very subtle was when you see George Eastman towards the beginning, he's in a room with his books, and one of the books says self-taught high school graduate or whatever.
Yeah.
Or something. Or like high school for self-taught men or whatever, Or so yeah, so it's on the nose, but it's effective visual storytelling. I agree. And as we've talked, I was definitely in the direction of a soft no at the beginning, but especially Anthony's points, I think he unpacked a lot of stuff for me. I see the design of this movie. I have to admit the trial with the melodramatic, the guy breaking the oar. What does that really do for us?
I like to imagine real quick, the attorney just has a trunk full of oars. Every trial he bursts that out, like, you did it, didn't you?
I have to say, I pictured that character as just Tony in about 20 years, folks.
Oh, God, I hope not. That guy's an asshole. I hate him.
For those of you who don't know, Tony is an aspiring attorney, and he's, so we'll see. But just, breaking off shards of wood into the jury box through the oar broken. And
yeah, it's amazing. It takes a while for it to get back there, too. It flies all the way through the air.
Yeah.
That shard of wood. Anyway, so... so I'd say the trial is a little weak, but, like I said, I like that, the complication, that sort of the second act of the movie a lot. And I would say you guys have made the case for its merits, and I would say it's a yes.
There we go. That's great. So that is a resounding yes, or at least
Unanimous.
3 yes. Yeah, unanimous is the better word. And points well taken about the last act of the movie. Not really sure. They could have made it 140 as opposed to 2 hours, but I don't know.
But I think, when he's struggling with it, that's really important. And when he comes back, the whole boat thing, when they're at the party and dancing around the Hawaiian shirts, and the guy throws the girl off the boat as a joke, and he has to hear her splash, and as soon as she hits the water, we cut back to Montgomery Clift just kind of wincing. I think that was great, But just the trial was a little lame, and the kind of police procedural stuff is a little lame.
True. All right, folks. So thanks for listening through our episode, but we're going to move to the final portion, which is the nomination for our next film. And if I am correct, Anthony has gone least recently, so he can dictate the order in which you 3 will nominate. Anthony, please take it away.
All right. So I'm going to take up Connor's challenge last week. I'm going to go second, I think. But first, I'll have Connor go first and Tony last.
All right. Let's hear it.
Okay. I was having trouble picking this week, Kirk. Of course, I've got a lot. But I wanted to get away from old movies. Perhaps to my chagrin, we'll all pick new movies, and that will kind of defeat the purpose. But I want to give you a little selection. I want to branch out a little bit. I still have a lot of old movies on the docket, 50s and 60s, classics. But I like to keep it a little more cool and hip and modern with the quintessential cool 90s film, Run Lola Run, Tom Tykwer. Classic. How do I put this? It's sort of a very elegantly designed, flashy, suspense, thriller kind of movie that has a kind of rhythm and vibe that's very much all its own that you can recognize certainly in other movies. We talked about, I think, in the context of like Amelie, we mentioned a certain kind of hyperactive editing. It's just a very interesting movie to watch. I think it still holds up. A very reined in, again, think Reservoir Dogs. The tendency of this time was to rein in plots to a certain level. Not so much in the way of social commentary on the surface, but just a very elegantly constructed plot with lots of suspense and just filmic powers on full display. I think it's really worth a watch if you need an injection of 90s cool.
Sorry, what's the general, just, like a 10-second plot?
Just a sort of general plot summary. Well, basically, it's, how do I put this? I can't quite remember. I wasn't prepared to give like a thumbnail thing. It's sort of like a crime plot.
Okay.
Sort of about a robbery.
She has to like deliver something to her boyfriend. She has it's like a ticking clock. Like she only has so much time, and they're going to kill him.
It's a ticking clock.
It's something like that.
Scenario.
Okay.
Concerning crime. Yes.
All right, Anthony, what do you got?
All right. So I was also debating between a number of different things, thinking about if I wanted to keep trying to convince you to watch some older films, but I think this time I'm going to renominate something. I don't know if I've done that before. We'll have to consult Connor's stat sheet, but I'm going to renominate one of my favorite films of 2019, which is Christian Petzold's director of Phoenix film Transit, which, if you don't remember, it's a German film about a guy who, well, I should explain in this sense is it sort of is interesting because it kind of collapses temporal boundaries. It sort of takes the kind of idea of the Nazis invading France and the refugee crisis that ensues, but it puts it in what may or may not be the modern day as we sort of follow this character who has to assume a dead person's identity to try to flee, with echoes of Casablanca and a very Anthony film, I'll say that, very romantic, very playful about nostalgia and the kind of things that affect our, contemporary life. So that's my nomination, Transit.
All right, Tony, you need a German movie too.
All right, I'm going to pitch, it's been suggested before, but Downfall, it's about Hitler. No, I have a Korean movie. This is one I pitched before. I thought of this because last week, or earlier this week, I rewatched Secret Sunshine by Lee Chang-dong. And my favorite movie from this director, who's done such movies as Burning, that was like a big critical smash a few years ago. I think it was 2019 as well. This movie is Oasis from 2002. I've suggested it once before. It is a very heavy movie. It's a very intense movie. I found it emotionally overwhelming when I first watched it, and I'm almost afraid to watch it again because I don't know if I'll have that same experience with it. But it is something to behold, and it basically is about a man who has gotten out of prison and commences a relationship with a woman with cerebral palsy. And it's a very, like, again, the word is intense, emotionally overwhelming, dark, twisted, uncomfortable, beautiful at times. It's just I've never seen another movie like it, and I was floored by it. I don't even have like a reading or like a real, like, I haven't like thought about this movie in like even an intellectual way. It was just a movie that overwhelmed me, and I'm really, really curious what you guys are going to make of it. I know I watched it with Connor, so I know roughly what he thinks, but I'm very curious. Well, I mean, just for myself, how it'll play on a second watch, and also how you guys will think of it. So that's my pitch.
What's the name of the film?
Oasis. No relation.
Yes. So we can go through rebuttals. Anthony, go ahead. If you have anything to add about yours or say about theirs.
Well, let's say, Tony, didn't we just watch 45 Years? You know, it sounds so... No. Tony sounds like a very Tony film. It's very, you know, do we want something so taxing? I don't know. I think Connor's could be cool. You know, it'd be cool, kind of cool to switch something up, a little bit more fast-paced, a little bit more propulsive, maybe. I'd say my film, it's definitely a sort of very me-focused type picture, but I think there's things that all of you would really gravitate towards. You know, I think the ideas of time, are always there for you, Kirk. Connor's interest in the history and the German is there. And it's also, it's a sort of throwback to kind of the, not necessarily A Place in the Sun, but like a sort of, like I said, Casablanca type filmmaking that I don't see. And, if we liked Phoenix, I think we'd like this one.
Okay. Connor?
Yeah, no, I mean, you've got, I think Oasis is like a quintessential, that'd be kind of a throwback Tony movie in a way. We're getting back to, I mean, it's better than Simon Killer by a long shot. But it has
this is burying me. He's trying to bury me, guys.
It has a similar provocative, which he's explained in the premise. That is the provocation, is the premise of the movie. I mean, it is also just a very well done movie. That's not pure provocation. It's not just a shock fest. It's just a difficult premise, right, that we have to grapple with, which makes it an interesting film, obviously. So I would definitely be up for watching it. I would say I just don't know Anthony's movie, but I have to admit he makes it sound appealing. He makes it sound like it's bridging the gap. It's got kind of our typical thinky kind of intellectual qualities to it, a little nostalgic, this kind of thing. Certainly reacting and kind of aware of film history. Run Lola Run is just kind of a thing of its own type. Again, I think Anthony was getting at what I was going for, something a little different, mixing up the pace, a little more propulsive, a little more frenetic, a little more crazy, a little lighter. And if that's what you're in the mood for, Kirk, I think you couldn't go wrong with Run Lola Run. And also it has an element of filmmaking panache to it that kind of, I think, puts it kind of in the halls of greatness. But I won't say it has as much meat on the bones, as much of a moral document, as, say, Oasis or Transit.
Yeah, I'll say these are very strong choices. I have not seen Transit, but everything I've heard about it makes it sound really cool. And I definitely want to watch it sooner or later. And I think Anthony definitely sounds like he's thought a lot about it and has things to say about it. Run Lola Run is just like a must watch. Like, Kirk, even if it doesn't get picked, you should watch it at some point. I think you have a blast with it. It is quintessential cool 90s. It's like, it's got panache, it's a ganache, it's a giraffe, it's got it all. It's the best thing. My movie, I can't really argue that it's better per se than these two, because that's such a subjective thing. I mean, you could hate this movie. I don't know. I mean, you could also love it. Like, this is very much a movie that you could either love or hate. I could definitely see either reaction, and it's difficult for sure, but I think it is worth grappling with. And it's in my top 10. I mean, it's up there for me. It's one that has made a mark on me for whatever reason. So make of that what you will. Yes, it is kind of a throwback Tony movie, very classic Tony, but worth watching. So, and even if we don't pick it, I think it's still worth watching on your own time. So,
all right. Trying to think here. So, okay, let me just make sure I have names of the movies right, just so I know what we're dealing with. So we have Run, Dora, Run. It's in the vein of Elsa Gate. It's about Dora the Explorer trying to escape a sex ring in Eastern Europe. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like the dark version of Dora the Explorer.
And then we have Lindsey Graham's recent biopic. Should be fun. And then, of course, the Mackenzie Phillips reenactment, Oasis. That one could be good too. So, you guys, you go so transgressive all the time. Let's see. I don't know. These films are great. There's no Mishimas in the bunch. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Oh, damn.
I'm sure I will enjoy when I eventually watch Mishima. I'll enjoy it. But it's a tough one. Yeah, it really is. What am I kind of in the mood for? Am I in the mood for kind of a frenetic, kind of fast-paced, supercharged film? Am I in the mood for a more temporally confounding film? From a director I really respect. I loved Phoenix. I thought it was excellent. Or am I in the mood for a film that looks to be pretty transgressive and might have, some heavy hitters? I gotta say, in a race as close as this, and I respect, because the last time Transit was nominated, I was actually the selector as well. So I respect that. I think Anthony truly wants me to watch this film. And I sometimes I have a habit of picking the least recent, and that might be perceived in a certain way, but truly I think you guys bring, when you're on the ropes, you bring it. So
I think there are multiple factors,
right.
I want
to watch all three, but I think my 45 years pick was kind of, I maybe I want to take a break from that type of movie at the moment, and I think I want to see what Transit has to offer. So I'm intrigued. Run Lola Run, I'll probably watch like tomorrow, but I'm actually intrigued to have Anthony kind of bring us into this world. And I wish we had done a podcast on Phoenix, because
so am I. And and the sentimental factor, man. Talking of nostalgia, Phoenix, first movie we all watched together.
It's all there for me. I really want to see this. It's kind of a full circle thing, a reckoning. So we're going to watch Transit next week, and we will hope to get the South Carolina senator on the horn, on the Zoom call for that film. But before we do that, I would just like to say thank you for listening. Hope you're staying safe, staying healthy. Have a great week. And Anthony, take us away.
I'll have what she's having.